Hi, I'm Jennifer Woosley Saylor. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor and the kid of a cop. And this is the podcast When the Call Hits Home.
Hey everyone, it's Ashlee Gethner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I'm also a child of a police officer.
Some topics in this episode are suited for mature audiences. Listeners who are sensitive, please be advised.
Welcome back to the podcast. I am Jennifer.
And I'm Ashlee.
We have an awesome guest today, one that, bless his heart, because I've been like, hey, can you meet with us? And then I ghosted him. And then I'm like, hey, can you meet with us? But that's the holiday season for sure. So we're excited to have our guest, Jeremy, on. So, Jeremy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Jeremy Davis. I've been a police officer for 30 years this year,
Wow.
actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
congratulations.
Woo-hoo.
Thank you. Yeah. Wondering when I'll retire. But I've been at 3 different agencies, some small, some large, a little bit of everything in there. I've worked patrol, street crime, street level narcotics, was a detective for a while, worked crimes for women and children. So all the child abuse and sex abuse cases. Was on SWAT team for a while, did a little bit of bike patrol. So haven't really figured out what I wanted to do.
That's amazing.
Well, and before the 30 years, you did something else too, right? Like in terms of service.
Well, I did, but I followed my dad around. My dad was in the military, and I traveled around with him until he got orders for Fort Polk, Louisiana, and said, Dad, I love you much. Have left nothing there. Have no desire to go back there. I think I'm going to branch out on my own. He got the last laugh, though. He was there less than a year and then got orders for Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. And I'm like, is it too late to come back?
Right. So you understand a little bit in terms of being raised in a military family, the service aspect of things. Yeah.
And that really, when I was thinking about today and the topics that we're getting into, I really looked at my childhood and how that kind of developed me into who I am, just because of the things that had gone on and the influence that my dad had on me, not just for service, but for leadership as well, and how you care and treat people. Well, it was a very good learning experience for me.
Well, I mean, this is so why we want you on the podcast. And, it might be a little bit why you have unicorn status. I'm like, man, a police officer that's willing to look back and reflect, like, so impressive. So impressive.
Well, don't let that get out too much. I mean,
yeah.
We do have an image to uphold.
Yes, we won't let anybody know that. That's the part
I was just about to say, right? I mean, you've done all these things. I'm laughing because earlier, we're like, oh, Jeremy's on here. He's amazing. And here I am like, poor Jeremy has never gotten rid of me. Like he came into my life and I was like, well, I'm not letting this one go. So, and now I'm like an adoptive daughter that he didn't want, but I just,
well,
here I am.
That's your own guilt. I've got 6 kids, 7 grandkids. What's one more?
What is one more?
Great.
I had to sneak it on in there. I mean, I remember watching you present, right? So we all met at a conference and I remember watching you present for the first time. And I was like, this person is incredible. Like your presentations are incredible. I've learned so much from you. I continue to, which is why I was like, yep, sticking by him.
Well,
so I'm just thankful. I mean, I'm thankful to have you on here. And can you talk a little bit about, I mean, obviously you gave us all this experience already, which is, we can't thank you enough for what you have done.
Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit about like some of your passions now? Because it seems like you really have tapped into a whole different world of like mental wellness and being for first responders.
Sure. So really the journey began because I was a police officer and I was a supervisor. And there were a couple incidents that happened that made me really stop and think, what is my responsibility as a supervisor for the well-being of my guys? Because we ask them to do all these things. We give them all these tools to do all these things. But the hardest thing to do, we never talk about, we never touch, we never teach. And that's how to kind of deal with the crap that sticks to us doing the jobs that we do. I talked about my dad was a big influence on me. one of the things that I remember growing up learning about leadership was from my dad, because every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, it wasn't just family. All of the soldiers that didn't have someplace to go, they would be at the house. And I really learned that from my dad, you have to care for your people. And it's not just can they do the job, it's their well-being and who they are outside of the job. And when you make that connection, you can do amazing things, and you can get your officers to do amazing things for you. In my dad's case, could get your soldiers to do amazing things for you. And that really stuck with me. And as I started suffering kind of some of these hard traumas, it really struck a chord with me as a supervisor is, what is my responsibility? So went to school, got a degree in HR. I don't know why I did HR, but I did. I did
It's a
have my
people.
master's in HR.
Uh-huh.
But then when I started working on my doctorate in leadership and organizational development, I really wanted to look at the aspect of, why do people do what they do when they're treated the way they are sometimes? And there has to be a deeper passion. And with police officers, it really is a passion. If you didn't have a passion for it, and it's the same for firefighters and EMTs, everything that we see day to day, if you didn't have a passion for it, you would not last very long.
Right.
Because it's real easy to say, you know what, I can do something making more money, a lot less stressful,
Yeah.
and just walk away.
Well, I think we're seeing that, aren't we? Like at alarming rates at this point.
Unfortunately, there are a lot, and yet we still have people that, hey, I want to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really what started me on the journey. And then as I started looking at it, I thought about my own kind of traumas and how I dealt with it. Where did I get the tools to kind of deal with what I was dealing with? Where was I lacking in tools to deal with what I wasn't dealing with? And again, it kind of goes back to family and upbringing. I was very blessed. My mom died when I was 6 months old, and my dad was given an option to either turn my sister and I over to my grandparents and stay in the Army or get out. My dad chose to get out and care for my sister and I. And for the first 7 years of my life, that foundational time frame, I saw my dad in action caring for my sister and I, and was never bitter that I could ever see. Was always positive, always had this outlook of, it's life. We make the best of it. Had a very strong faith. And it's funny, one of the things when I was growing up is he said, you can't have my faith. You have to have your own faith for your own reasons. If you're doing it because of me, it's not going to last. So you have to kind of find your own way. And that journey kind of helped me understand, okay, when I can't deal with things, I have a dad that's willing to be there. I have my faith that I can fall back on. And that's what got me through a lot. We talked a little bit about how comfortable I am, so I'll kind of broach this subject. One of the things that really made me question who I was and what I was made of, so to speak, is I had to work a fatality where a 7-month-old infant was burned to death in a car. And the officers and I could not do anything, and we had to listen as this child died. On a lot of levels, that struck a chord with me. A lot of feelings of inadequacy, a lot of feelings of failure. You know, I had this great example of my dad as a father who gave up a career and did all these things to care for his children. So a father is supposed to be there. And as a father, how could I not do more? How could I not protect this child? As a man, our job is to be protectors. And again, I failed. So I failed as a father. I failed as a man. As a police officer, we're supposed to have all of those solutions. We're supposed to be the ones that can fix these problems. You know, here I am, a SWAT officer, do all these high-speed things, and yet I failed. There was a lot of guilt. Added to that, once this incident's over, I remember the very next call that we had that I had to send officers out on was a stupid barking dog call.
Mm.
And I remember getting angry, like, do you understand what I just did? And you're worried about some dog doing what a dog does. Are
Right.
you effing kidding me? And then I felt even worse because as a good supervisor, guys, we got to take the next call.
Right.
And that stuck
Mm.
for a long time. I did not deal with that trauma at all. I'll just being honest. For over a decade,
Wow.
I never talked to anybody about it. No one. There was one guy that was out there with me. About a year later, we talked about it for maybe 10 minutes.
Right.
And both came to the realization that don't like the way this makes me feel. It sucks, but it's our job. And so neither one of us really wanted to broach it or deal with it. It started to affect me a lot. I was getting maybe 2 hours of sleep a night if I was lucky. When it started to affect me physically after about a decade, one, just getting older, my body couldn't do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Did a sleep study, and I failed a sleep study. Didn't know that was possible. Doctor said, here, I'm going to give you some medicine. You're going to go to sleep. We'll get all these results. And I only slept for about 2.5 hours and was wide awake. And they're like, that's not really enough time. We gave you this medicine. You should be out. And I'm like, I can't go back to sleep. And this is why. This is the nightmare that I'm having.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to go back to sleep. And it was at that point, the sleep specialist said, there's nothing I can do for you. I'm like, that's not how this works.
Right.
You know, you're
Right.
supposed to help me. And that was my first clue that I needed psychological help. And that's what he was basically telling me. There,
Yeah.
as a sleep specialist, I can't fix what's preventing you from sleeping.
Right.
And that started my path down understanding what I thought was PTSD. Don't use that term lightly.
Not
You've
at
seen my
all.
presentations. I love people who self-diagnose, and it's like, hang on. For PTSD, here's all these criteria. You have to check all these boxes. And if you don't, it's not PTSD. It may be PTS,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a little bit different. But I was eventually diagnosed with PTSD and really wanted to kind of understand how to fix myself, because I knew that there were 3 other people out there with me that were probably suffering just as much, if not more, than I was.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, the more I looked into it, I came across a study through the military, Dr. Bryan, who was looking at soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and he was looking at something called moral injury.
Yeah.
And the more I looked at moral injury, the more I thought, do I really have PTSD or do I have moral injury? There's kind of 2 trains of thought. There's one group of people that think moral injury is kind of a precursor to PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Let me back up for a minute. Moral injury is, we all have these values and these beliefs, and as police officers, our beliefs and our values are even stronger because we have that strong sense of right or wrong.
Right.
That's why we do what we do. There's a very hard, this is right, this is wrong mentality. And what happens in moral injury is we either do something, witness something, or fail to take action on something that violates our beliefs.
Yeah.
And so when I was talking about with this child, I'm a failure as a man, I'm a failure as a father, I'm a failure as a police officer, I'm a failure as a supervisor. Those all went against what I believe to be true about all these different aspects. You know, I raised my dad up on this pedestal as this great leader because I see him taking care of all of his guys, doing all these things.
Yep.
I see him as a wonderful dad that took care of my sister and I for 7 years by himself. My grandparents were there, but it was my dad. And so all of these images that I had of what should be had now just been assaulted. And so a lot of people think that moral injury is a precursor to PTSD because it breaks down who we think we are. There's another group that thinks it's separate from PTSD and it's kind of own thing.
Yeah.
Not a professional, not a psychologist, just a cop. My belief is that they're separate because looking at PTSD and having talked with a professional and being given that diagnosis, I 100% accept that. But there was another aspect of it that the more I looked at moral injury and the more I talk with officers, there's a large feeling of guilt and shame for what they've done or not done. I should have done more. I could have done this.
Right.
That really strikes at the moral injury because who you thought you were as a person is now being put into question in a way that is indescribable.
Right.
It forces you to even question, is what I believe true? And that can be very difficult to deal with. And that started me down that road. And what's interesting is through all of my therapy, they were treating me for PTSD. And that was wonderful. But what really got me kind of over that hump, I think had more to do with the moral injury and something that happened with the moral injury. One of the things that I did at one of my jobs is I would do safety days for the military. Even though I'm not in the military, I work near a military base. The hospital always had a safety day where they had, here's boating safety, here's lawnmower maintenance safety, here's, all the things that we need to do. And they had me come out as a reconstructionist for the police department to talk about collisions and driver safety and DUIs and things like that. And one of the people that was doing part of the DUI safety was a gentleman that had lived through the Carrollton bus crash. He was a young man when this occurred. Part of his therapy that he did to heal himself is he went out and bought a bus that's exactly like the bus that was involved in the crash. Painted it up exactly the same. And then inside of the bus, he has pictures of all of the people and where they were sitting, as well as where they were found, and has little blurbs on it.
Ashlee, are you familiar with the Carrollton bus accident?
I am not as familiar. I feel like I have heard about it.
Well, I
Probably.
was just gonna say, in terms of, people listening, it was one of the first cases, well, not first cases of drunk driving, but it made national news. A drunk
Right.
driver went the wrong way on an interstate and crashed into a bus of kids from
The church. It was a church group coming
group,
back from an amusement
Kings
park.
Island. Yeah. Go ahead, Jeremy. I just was
The-
thinking in
yeah.
case people weren't familiar with that
Well,
story.
ironically, and this is kind of ties into it,
Mhm.
because what happened in that bus crash is when the crash happened, the bus caught fire.
Mhm.
There were some safety issues, and the kids and the adults were not able to get off of the bus, and many of them died in the fire.
Yeah.
I would never go on the bus because, again,
Right, of what your
part of
experience
moral
was.
injury and PTSD is that avoidance.
Mhm.
So I can stand next to it, but I don't have to go
Yeah.
into it.
Right.
Well, the third year I was doing this program, the gentleman that did the bus and kind of explained everything and walked everybody through what was going on said, "Hey, I've got to step away. There's only like 20 minutes left in the day. If somebody comes up, can you kind of explain it to them?" I'm like, "Sure." Thinking last 20 minutes of the day, Nobody's going to
Nobody's
come.
coming.
Please don't let anybody come. Please don't let
He said
anybody
in the
it's
come.
military.
over. It's over.
Well, yeah, but guys in the military, if it's the last 20 minutes, they're finding things to do to not have to
Right.
work.
Right.
And there was a woman who was 9 months pregnant with her husband that came up and said, "Would you mind walking us through the bus?" I did. It took a lot.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
But as I did it, I was thinking about my incident and this child dying in this horrible way, seeing how this man who had lived through something like that had turned it into a positive,
Mm-hmm.
and then seeing this pregnant woman realizing life still happens.
Yeah.
There's still happiness that can be found. There's still that growth, and maybe I'm not as much of a failure as I thought,
Mm-hmm.
because I learned from it. I would say it took me quite a while to grow from it. But when I did grow, I turned it into something positive. And that really helped change my mind frame. And it's not something that we did in therapy through PTSD. It was more that moral injury aspect of understanding I'm okay. I'm still the person who I was. I didn't fail. There are some things that are just outside of our control. I know you guys being kids of cops, control is our biggest issue.
What?
I have to control the
Never.
situation.
Never knew that growing up every day.
Every day.
Every day.
But that really is what helped change my attitude. The other thing that kind of helped me grow, because I know this is dealing with kids and kids of first responders, my son left for the Marine Corps. And when he came back, we had a really hard discussion. And he said, "Dad, I felt like I couldn't fail. You wanted me to be perfect."
Yep.
And it was like, that was never my intent. I wanted you to be better because I knew what you were capable of, but I never expected you to be perfect. I'm not perfect. Here's all these inadequacies that I have. And that's when I realized that part of that moral injury transferred to my kids, because what it did for me is it made that compass of mine of what is right and what is wrong, what it is to be a father, what it is to be a man, what it is to be a police officer, kind of hyper fixated it
Yeah.
to, I have to be the best. And if I'm not the best, I have to find out why. And I have to try and be that way. And so I started expecting more of myself than I really should have.
So I
And
have
that
to wrap
trickled
this
down.
around, though.
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have to wrap
Nope.
this around for our listeners, right? Because something that Jennifer and I have talked about, I talk about it all the time. I talk about it at such great length. And I'm so I'm excited. I'm excited that you just said all that, because you said it so beautifully and so well. But I call those like unrealistic expectations from that
Right.
parent who is a first responder onto their family.
And that's exactly what I realized, is that even though I was putting those expectations on myself, I was actually putting it on my children as well.
Yes.
And it unintentionally
Well, of course.
Right.
expecting them to kind of meet a very unrealistic standard.
Yes.
And I kind of couched it going, no, I don't want you to be perfect, but you can do so much more. You have so much more potential. I see these things in you. And it wasn't until we had that hard conversation, and then I had it with two of my daughters as well, where it was like, no, I never expected you to be perfect. And if I wasn't at the place I had been, I would have felt like a failure as a father again, because here I am having my kids tell me all this. But we were able to have that honest conversation. And it's like,
that's the important part.
Oh,
Right.
yes. I mean, I think the ability to communicate that and have that conversation is credible. I also think as human beings, and coming back to this definition of moral injury, this is this value system, this belief that you have that really anchors us, right? Like,
Yeah.
Right.
wrong, right? Like, these are my bumpers, for bowling. Like, this
Right.
guides me. And when that, you know, gets taken away or challenged, as human beings, we're going to lean more into all the things to try to build that back.
Yeah.
Right. And so again, it's not even this conscious thing of like, okay, well, I feel like a failure. So now I'm going to make everything in my power to never be a failure again. It's not this thinking thing, right? It's
Right.
just those things that slowly show up.
And yeah, I mean, I can't, you're saying that perfectly. I'm currently doing presentations for a police department by me, but they asked me to do it on what it's like to be a child of a first responder. And I talk about exactly this, right? Like I talk about exactly, and I think like I'm getting like choked up right now because I'm like, this is the most beautiful wraparound that I've ever experienced because what we're saying is you came back to communicate it. But what I
Mhm.
recognize as a therapist now, as a child of a first responder, like a lot of families don't have that conversation. They don't tap into any of this, right? And so as the child of a first responder, like you are just left feeling like you will never live up, you will never make that parent proud. Like you will, and you're always pulled to do so,
Well,
right?
it's a very hard conversation to have
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
because as a first responder, as a police officer, and I know we've joked about this before, I've got 6 brothers and sisters, and every time they're introduced by my parents, this is my son Josh, this is my son Jason, this is my daughter Rebecca, this is my daughter Tina. He gets to me, this is my son Jeremy, he's a cop.
Right.
Automatically,
Right.
it's not
Your
just my name;
identity.
it's
Yeah.
what I do. And even for my kids, they see me as this police officer, and they see what standards I hold myself to, and to humble yourself and go, look, yes, I that is what I aspire to, but I'm also a person,
Yeah.
and I fail and I make mistakes, and I don't mean to do these things intention. This was It's hard to humble yourself in front of your kids, and these kids who, when they're 7, 8, 9, 10, think, oh, you're perfect. This
Mm-hmm.
is who I want to be. Because I remember looking at my dad, even into my teens,
Yep.
wanting to be like my dad. And oddly, when I was 16, I remember talking to my dad one morning at like 2 in the morning saying, Dad, I want to be just like you. And him going, no, son, if you want a good role model, you want to be like your grandfather.
Mm.
And so again, it just reinforced that you can be a man, you can be strong, you can be this person people look up to, but still be humble and still be willing to admit it's not as perfect as you think. I do make mistakes. And that really helped me have that conversation with my kids. And for first responders out there, it's hard,
It is. Well, and I want
but
to say
humble
too,
yourself.
well,
Right.
and that whole thing too about, having the conversation, I think sometimes it's the reality of we're just living in it. We don't
Yeah,
have this
Right.
awareness. Like I really, and Jeremy, I just appreciate your story so much, but that ability to say like, it really took the time to look at yourself and looking for at others, like that's its own process. And I think that to recognize that, like if we're saying, okay, have these conversations with your families, have these conversations age appropriate with your children.
sure. Yeah,
It starts with have these conversations with yourself,
Yeah.
right? Like
Right.
have this time to reflect. And, I kind of teased about you being a unicorn and, that you kind of thought about your childhood. But, there's some places that, if we're willing to look in those things and coming back to
right.
this concept of moral injury, let's just start there. Like, what is your wrong and right?
Right.
this doesn't even have to be a negative. Like, what is your wrong or right? What do you believe in? What is your value system?
Right. And that's why I mentioned what my dad had said, about faith. You can't go based off of me because it won't last. If you're
Right.
doing something based off of me, it's not going to last. And so that's part of I had to find out for myself
Yep.
what I believe and why about all of these things, not just my faith, but all of these things. And you talk about age appropriate. My conversation was very age appropriate because, like I said, I waited till my son got out of Marine Corps boot camp. So
He's a grown up.
Yeah, right.
And but in a way that also made it harder because they're adults now, and
Yeah.
to sit back because all of my kids were over 20 when I had this conversation with them, and just said, I'm sorry for the failings that I had, which was very good for me because the kids were like, no, we don't see it that way. Not saying
Of
that
course
you were
not.
perfect, not saying our childhood was perfect, but we understand why you did what you did. And after having these conversations, it makes more sense.
Yeah.
Again, not that everything is sunshine and rainbows, not that we had this perfect childhood, but I understand.
Right.
And that helped me as well come to terms with, okay, I'm not as much of a failure as I thought I was, because I have my wonderful kids saying, no, we still rely on you. We still value you. It was good. Have that conversation.
Yes, definitely have that conversation for sure. And even if they are adults, obviously we want to have it
Yeah.
before then, but it's never too late to, thinking about people that are retired and things like that.
If you can recognize it, and especially with preteens, early teens, if you can recognize it at that point and kind of have that conversation, it's funny. My daughter is the one, Deborah, my youngest daughter, said, Dad, you tell us all the time that we need to give ourselves some grace. Sometimes you need to give yourself grace.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Ouch. But if you can have that conversation with your kids and say, look, I'm trying, but there's things that happen and I don't realize I'm doing that. And if I do, give me a little bit of grace and just kind of remind me, hey, Dad, it's me. I'm trying, but we're kind of, this is the way I feel, and accept that. Okay, am I overcompensating because of what I feel? Am I acting out of what my intent is? Because I think a lot of times that's what happens is when we act out or we do things, our intent is to do A, but we end up doing B unintentionally.
Right.
And the kids see the B, and if they bring it to our attention, to say, you know what, that wasn't my intent. This is what I was really looking for. And it will, I think, not a therapist, but I think it will really help both the parents and the children understand better.
Yeah, you make a great point.
Yeah, I'll be a therapist for a second. And I just want to talk about this. And I don't necessarily, I'm not asking for us to share deeper, but I do think the power of the feeling of shame. It is an incredibly, incredibly hard feeling.
Yeah.
And, talking about failures and all these things, like that's such a shame response. And the thing about shame and human beings, we'll do a lot of things to not feel that.
Yes.
A lot of things to not feel shame because it is such a heavy, heavy feeling. And I appreciate you sharing your story. And I think about, you have this experience and how it can build on it. Where some people like that cloak of shame is so thick, like we can't even get to like, where was the root of this? And I think it's great, your story, Jeremy, to say of like, well, I was willing to like peel back and go through those things to kind of find out where that really came from. But I just want to say that for people, because I do think that shame is a hard feeling. And I don't know that we've completely understand what it will really drive people to do sometimes.
Well, but I also think too, right? Like Jeremy, you said a key word to me, right, as a clinician as well. I can't help it, but like, and that was acceptance.
Hmm.
All right.
You have to,
Well,
you
and
said we have to accept it, right?
right.
And I
And
don't think that happens often, and I think that can be because of shame,
Yep.
right?
it,
Like,
because shame is so, it's hard to wash off.
yes,
And
yes,
this is why I think moral injury is so important to kind of understand for yourself, because what I feel shameful of, someone else may not,
Right.
because it's based on my morals,
correct.
my beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
how I value things, and that is so highly individualistic. It's hard to wash that off.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, even if we're being brutally honest here, right? Life happens and life happens really fast. Does anybody really take the time to be like, what are my core values? Because
Right.
they change.
Yeah.
They do.
Oh,
They
oh,
change.
absolutely.
And we do not, as humans,
Absolutely.
take the time to say, hey, what is it that I believe in right now? What is it that makes me me? Am I feeling this way because it is a core value being compromised? Right? Like I don't
Right.
want to go down the rabbit hole of boundaries and all those things, but like most of the time we feel crummy. And why do we feel crummy? Because we are compromising a value of ours that we haven't recognized.
Right.
Right. Whether intentionally or unintentionally,
Exactly. Yep.
and we still recognize it.
Mm-hmm.
We may not recognize it up in the forefront of our brain, but in the
Yeah.
back, it's like, hey, hello, this isn't what we believe in. It is possible. It's hard. And you talk about being willing to. I kind of laugh, and I was forced into it. When I started looking at therapy, I'll give a plug for EMDR. It's great, but I was kind of hard-headed control freak. It took me 7 sessions for it to finally click. But then I was forced even more, because like I said, what really helped me get past that feeling was being on that bus and explaining what had happened and walking past those pictures and kind of seeing all of that reality swirling around. Kind of smacked me in the face and said, well, you got to deal with it now. Don't really have a choice.
A little bit of exposure therapy happening.
Yeah. Well, and that's when I talk to people and I tell them, we all have trauma. Some is easy to get over, some is not.
Right.
If it's not easy to get over, please do it on your time, because if you don't, I promise you, it will pick the most inopportune time to
Right.
rear its ugly head and say, okay, you have to deal with me now. And we may not have the resources around us at that time to deal with it. So take the time. If you've got those traumas that are hard to deal with,
Yeah.
take the time to say, you know what, I'm going to deal with it now. As uncomfortable as it is, I know I've got the support system. I know I've got the people I can reach out to. I can do this now. And take that hard step before it rears its ugly head and you're not ready for it.
Right.
Well, and I just want to say too, I mean, the courage, and I would imagine some of your value system here, when somebody has you like, hey, will you cover this for me? Something that you don't want to be a part of, it could have been easy to say no.
Yeah.
It could have been easy you'll have to walk yourself on that bus because I'm not getting onto it.
Right.
And I think that that's a little bit it's such the fabric of first responders, though, right? Like it's
Yeah.
about doing the right thing, even if I'm uncomfortable at times. And so, how we can do that for others, right? Because you did that for the person that needed you to cover. You did that for that young couple that came up to the bus. And it's just like you're allowed to do those things for yourself as well. I mean, I think that's a thing that I see sometimes in first responders, what we'll do for our neighbor, what we would do for, the people in the community we serve. And we just sometimes forget that we're allowed to do those things for ourselves. It's kind of
And
what your daughter said about the
yeah,
grace. Like we can give
Yep.
ourselves grace too.
yeah, that was kind of that slap in the, the backhanded compliment of my daughter. Hey, you tell us, give us grace, you give yourself some. It's like, okay.
Well, listen, I know that you read a lot, and I feel like there's some books about moral injury. I don't know if you'd have one that like you would recommend if people are like more interested. And if you don't know off the top of your head, it's fine. You know,
Well, there's one that I like, and all I remember is Power, because it's Power is the main title, and then there's it's something with law enforcement, but Dr. Papalalu put it together. There's lots of different doctors that got together, put it together brilliantly. It doesn't just cover moral injury; it's police ethics and behavior. And even though it's written by a bunch of doctors, it's written in a way that is very easy to read.
I like
Very
that.
easy to read.
Good.
The Body Keeps the Score, or Body Keeps the Count.
It's Body Keeps the
Um,
Score. You're right.
Yeah, Body Keeps the
Yeah,
Score.
Ashley and I know that one.
Yeah.
It really is. And then at the conference that you guys and I had met at, started passing around books. The Knight in Rusty Armor.
I loved that.
Very, very good book. Very easy read. I highly recommend it. But then there's a companion to it, because my wife was like, "Oh, that's you. See, I'm kind of poking her finger about all these
Yeah,
things
yeah.
that, yes, I get it." There's another book, Letters of Juliet to the Knight in Rusty Armor. And I read it. It's about the same size, easy read, takes a couple hours maybe. But then I looked at it and I said, "See, this is you." Because Juliet is the knight's wife, and
Right.
she goes on her own journey, and it's kind of funny. I gave it to one of my officers to read, and he goes, "You know what's funny is I noticed at the beginning of the book, she's saying in her letters to her husband, 'Dear Sir,' very informal, kind of standoffish, because of what has happened in their relationship, to where at the end she's like, 'My love,' in that journey of coming back." So recommend both of those as well.
And we'll put those like in the show notes. But like I said, I know you're very well read. And so I was like, oh, if you had any books for our listeners about moral injury. So I appreciate
Well,
that.
the rest of the moral injury stuff that I read are a lot of the technical, like Dr. Bryan's paper, very academic. If you get into those, I highly recommend his research, because he's done a lot of good work.
Yeah.
But they're mainly academic, and I know most people will get through like page 2 and be like, "Okay, I'm done, ready to take a
Yeah.
nap."
Yeah.
Well, I think you did a good job of some summation of some of that work already. So like they don't even have to go read it, because you gave
Yeah,
us
that's
some
fair.
great information about moral injury and its impact.
Thank
And
you.
I appreciate your willingness to talk about moral injury in such a personal way too, Jeremy. You don't have to
Sure.
go and make it this like presentation, you make it so personal about that experience that you've had. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And I know
Absolutely.
we're running a little bit, we're getting closer to time here. But I did want to throw something, because I think we have a really awesome opportunity to do so. And I think that this could lead to probably another whole episode, honestly. But because you've been so open with us already about your positions in life, right? In these leadership roles that you take. I love
Sure.
moral injury. Started because of you and your presentation and wanting to learn more about it. But one of the things that I have come to just see within my research, right? We talk so much, and your example was perfect, because when we do give examples, we give a ton of examples of what it's like for military, right? But I love that you were able to give it to us and what it could be for an officer and a real life example of that. But something that I think we often don't talk about in terms of moral injury, though, is this notion of betrayal. I
Oh,
don't know if you've heard of that
absolutely.
with moral injury, but I've
Mhm.
really tapped into that. And it talks about, I have my notes, so I'm looking down a little bit, sorry, but it's this betrayal occurs when an individual feels betrayed by a higher authority. And I bring this up only because I think that, like, it sounds like you have reflected upon the fact of like your own leadership position with this, right? But how
Right.
how quickly people who are in power in these jobs can have this impact, everything that we've talked about, upon those underneath them. Am I making sense? Like,
You
so,
no, you are, because my dissertation is on how social support, specifically the peers, their immediate supervisors, and command staff, impact an officer's willingness to stay at a job when they haven't got promoted. Because I know officers that have spent 20 years in the career, never made it past patrolman, never been a detective, never had a special assignment, and they still do 20 years. What
yeah.
is it that keeps them? And interestingly, and I don't want to get too far into this because
I
my
know.
paper's not been approved yet, but interestingly, one of the things
Yes.
that I have
Yeah.
found is that the command staff's support and approval is very important, but it's the least observed. It's the least felt.
Mm.
And there's a disconnect because a lot of the supervisors, a lot of the command staff go, well, we do A, B, C, D, and E for our officers, and it's not what the officers want. And they're not, and I'm going to kill myself when it comes to doing presentations on this later, but all these command staff go to these presentations and get all this wonderful knowledge and go, oh, well, this is what I need to do, and implement things without talking to the officers.
Right.
My presentation may be great. There may be lots of good information, but find out what your officers need, because there was an entire study done by the International Association of Chiefs of Police that found out there's a huge disconnect between what officers need and want and what command staff thinks they need and want. So they think they're doing this great job
Right.
when they're actually, I don't want to say betraying the trust, but I'm looking for your approval and you're giving me exactly opposite of what I'm looking for.
Right.
Right.
And I even brought this up just to say that like, just the notion of, if you are in these positions within the department, how much you can impact those around you, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that there's so much research now about moral injury, and we're talking about moral injury being the root of such disturbance in these first responders' lives, and that can come from your command staff. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, just the importance of at least tapping into yourself to recognize that you hold that power.
Yeah. There's a lot of research out there that looks at agency betrayal.
Yeah.
And if you, not that you want to go down the negative road, but you want to find
No.
out about agency betrayal, ask an officer, hey, can you tell me about how the agency's betrayed you? I hope you've got 4 or 5 hours, or have a good way to say, okay, I'm done, I need to leave.
Grab the coffee. Yeah.
Yeah, because it is real. And again, I
Sad.
don't think all of it is intentional.
Nope. No, I wouldn't say
Which
it
is the sad
right?
part.
Yes.
Right. It's the sad part is I don't think a lot of the command staff are doing it intentionally. There are some. Don't get me wrong.
It's like anything else. Yeah.
Right.
Like anything else, there are those that just, they don't need to be in the positions they're in. But for a lot of them, I know their best interest. Again, my intent is I have the best interest of the officers at heart. But the way I put it into words, the way I put it into action, and the way it's received is so far removed from my intent.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, one, it's hard for officers to tell command staff, hey, you're kind of screwing up because this is what you said and this is the way it came across. And it's hard for command staff to allow an officer to go, I felt absolutely disrespected when you said this.
Right.
I know that's not what you meant,
Right.
but I felt absolutely disrespected. So it's hard for the officer to say it. And if they do say it, it's hard. I'm going to tell you as a supervisor,
Right.
it's hard sometimes being called out and somebody saying, you treated me like crap, or you
Yeah.
made me feel this way, because we get defensive. Well, that wasn't my intent.
Right.
Right.
So,
Well, I just hope you're giving yourself credit, right? Like, I think that you are a really good example of leadership and being able to implement these things that help those around you, you know? And you said it on here a million times over, and I hope our listeners hear that as well and just kind of take that to heart. But I had to bring it up because I was like, when I'm doing this research that just keeps pointing like a red, like highlighted, bold, I'm like, driving me crazy.
Well, and I was just, it's funny, Ashley. I mean, I kind of knew you were going to bring it up, but I definitely was thinking it earlier.
I'm a little sassy, guys. I'm a little sassy.
Well, not even like that. You, you know, I mean, Jeremy, a career of 30 years, and, you know, I'll just speak from my own career. You see what I thought going into this career would be, and then what it is, you know, and I think sometimes that can happen in terms of, again, this value system. Like,
Right.
you know, I want to go in and help everybody, and then realizing, oh, well, you know, some people don't want to be helped or whatever that is. And like you kind of have to evolve with that. And I think was
Right.
a point that was made earlier too about just the evolution of our values and things like that. But I do think that there's that piece of it as well. And you know, listen, Ashley, you're the sociologist. So the systems, I mean, the systems here with our first responders and
I just keep trying to fight the good fight, y'all.
Well,
I know.
For supervisors, I'll give you two real quick examples. One is a horrible supervisor. I was unhappy, went to try and say, I'm not happy. What can we do to change? And their response is, well, if you're not happy here, I don't want you here. Go ahead and quit.
Ugh.
Okay.
I hear that all the time.
If that's the way you feel,
right.
That is a horrible example. But then I have another supervisor who had to call me out on some things and made an offhanded comment that I know they meant in a positive way. They said, Jeremy, this just isn't you, but this is the way it appears. And when he said, this is the way it appears, it felt like a personal attack. And I said, you know what? I'm offended that you would say that. Here's why. Again, I'm a supervisor, so it's a little bit easier for me as a supervisor to tell command staff that. A lot of my command staff will tell you I don't play well with others. But to his credit, he heard what I had to say, and he took a step back and he goes, okay, I'm sorry you took it that way. I didn't mean it that way. I'm just saying, when I get this complaint and I look at you and I know who you are and I've known you all these years, that's not who I see. So there had to be something there. I didn't mean it kind of the way it came across. And so we were able to have that conversation. That's a good supervisor. Yeah. That's what we need more of. He stood his ground. He still said, hey, I've got to talk to you about this. It is what it is. But he was willing to hear what I had to say and say, okay, I get it. This was my intent, and kind of have that intent delivery speech, right, as opposed to, well, you don't want to be here, bye.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we need more of the second leadership, but we have more of the first.
Right. Right.
Isn't it weird how it all comes back to communication and listening?
It's a powerful thing, and yet it's a really hard thing. And when you think about what all entails with communication, you know, things have to go from the front of our brain down to our mouth. It can take a long time. And then we got to use our ears and take that information and make sense of it. Yeah, it can be a hard thing to do.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we are so appreciative that you came on today, honestly.
Yes,
thank you so much, Jeremy.
He's
our favorite human right here. One of our favorite humans.
The unicorn,
thank you.
Jeremy.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And like taking the time again today to be with us. And I think people are going to hear this, and I guarantee you we're going to get the comments if they want more Jeremy Davis on here. So I don't think this is the last time we're going to have you. That's for sure.
Well, I hope it's all positive.
It will be. It will be
for sure.
You're awesome.
Well, thank you. And honestly, like we have a lot more coming up this year. So stay tuned. Keep listening to us. We love our supporters.
Tell all my guys, listen to them. They're great. Not just because I'm on here. I told them when you guys first came out, listen. Said to my kids, said listen to it because, you know, it may explain why I did some of the stupid things I did. Well, you never know.
Well, that's
But
that's
I
incredible.
appreciate you guys. Yeah, I appreciate what you guys are doing. It is important. I know you say it's for the kids, but for the first responders themselves to kind of
Mhm.
get that, hey, unintentionally, I may be doing this. Let me fix it so that I can have that better relationship and not overcomplicate things for my kids.
Yeah. I mean, it breaks my heart when I hear about families that are first responder families and there's estrangement between parents
Yep.
and
Yeah.
their kids. So, we definitely want to foster that and make sure that that just doesn't happen in our foster care
Yeah.
or our first responder families.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
All right, you guys. Well, don't forget that when the call hits home, Jennifer and I are here for you. We'll listen to you. We'll listen to you. Look at now we're all we're all messed up here. But we will be on soon. So keep listening to us and thank you.
Thank you.